It's time for Americans, it's time for Christians to take a stand and say, I will stand for truth. I will stand against political correctness. I will stand for truth. I will stand against deception. I will stand. Don't let the newspaper define who you should be. Don't let the commentators tell you who should be. You take a stand for God. Let us begin by reading Psalm 9:17, and then we'll read Psalm 33:12. But first, reading Psalm 9:17. The wicked shall be turned into hell, and all the nations that forget God. The wicked shall be turned into hell, and all the nations that forget God. And then Psalm 33:12 says, Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. Blessed is that nation whose God is the Lord. Well, they would like to tell us that our founding fathers were atheistic, agnostics, deists, that they did not give us a Christian nation. But I would like to take a few moments and examine the historical record. First of all, of the 55 founding fathers who worked on our Constitution, 52 out of the 55 were evangelical Christians. They were evangelical Christians who worked and labored. In fact, the American Tract Society put out a number of tracts, and the interesting thing is when you look at the American Tract Society and you look at the book, you find, look at the authors. They read like a who's who of our founding fathers, and the board of directors of the American Tract Society really reads like a list of our founding fathers. Patrick Henry said this. He said, it cannot be emphasized too often that this nation was founded not by religionists, but by Christians and on the gospel of Jesus Christ. This is the man who's famous for saying, give me liberty or give me death. But he says it was founded not by religionists, but it was founded on the gospel of Jesus Christ. Well, one other one, John Quincy Adams, one of our presidents, Secretary of State, and other things. He said this. He said the highest glory of the American Revolution was this. It connected in one indissoluble bond the principles of civil government with the principles of Christianity. Now wait a minute. Do you get that? He said it connected in an indissoluble bond that cannot be broken, the principles of civil government and Christianity. That is the truth. That was his writings in a letter to his wife when they enacted the Constitution. He said, we have an indissoluble bond. Ben Franklin said, I move that henceforth, this was at the First Continental Congress, by the way. He said, I move that henceforth prayers imploring the blessing of heaven on our deliberation be held every morning before we proceed to business, and that one of the local clergy should officiate. Did you know that at the meeting of the Congress, this was not a 1-minute prayer. It wasn't, oh God, bless us, help us, give us success. Did you know at the Continental Congress, when Benjamin Franklin moved that they open every session in prayer? Do you know how long they prayed? The first time was 3 hours, with all of the people on their knees imploring God to bless this nation. What a change. What a change in this nation. You know, the New England Primer, I was going to bring one in here. The New England Primer. You know, back then textbooks were called a primer. I don't know if anybody remembers anything like that, but it's a little book. I've got one, and it has the alphabet. Guess how the alphabet is listed? Bible verses. A starts with an A. B starts with a B. C, every one is a Bible verse taught in our public schools. It was introduced in 16-something, and it was taught right up to the early 1900s. What an amazing thing that our schools teach the Word of God. Our leaders say we are a Christian nation. What about George Washington's farewell address? I would challenge anybody to find his farewell address in a public school textbook. Anybody, find it in a public school textbook. You won't. George Washington, he is treated now, you don't hardly ever hear his name. What is his problem? The problem is what he says. George Washington, who was praying at Appomattox, said, of all the habits and dispositions which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who would lobby to subvert these great pillars. George Washington, leading. What about our forms of government? We've got one form of government. We have one form that we've started in 1789. What about France? How many governments has France been through since then? 8. How many governments has Italy been through since then? 48. Our political professors of political science decided that they would make a study, and they spent 10 years, 15,000 documents, and they were gathering all of this material together, and they were going to find out where the founding fathers got their ideas. What they discovered was that the 3 most often quoted people were Blackstone, John Locke, and Montesquieu. But they found out that 34% of all of the writings and quotations came directly from the Bible. 34%. And then they discovered that another 60%, they were quoting somebody who was quoting indirectly the Bible, so about 94% of their quotations came from the Bible. Wait a minute. Where do we get the ideas? Separation of powers, Jeremiah chapter 17. Where do we get the three branches of government? Isaiah 33:22. What about tax exemptions for churches? Mexico doesn't have it. Canada doesn't have it. Where do they get that? Ezra chapter 7, verse 24. And then one other one, the Church of the Holy Trinity. This was a case in 1892. A case, you can read it, it's in the record today. You can read the Church of the Holy Trinity, a U.S. Supreme Court case, 1892. Here's a quote from that case. It says, "Our laws and our institutions must necessarily be based upon and embody the teachings of the Redeemer of mankind. It is impossible that it should be otherwise. And in this sense, our civilization and our institutions are emphatically Christian." Do you get that? The U.S. Supreme Court declared we are a Christian government. We are a Christian government born in Christianity, born by the hand of God. We were born. In that case, it was only 16 pages. It gave 87 precedents. And they said we could go on, but there's no need to, because here's 87 precedents. 87 precedents of this kind. Where did Thomas Jefferson, anybody know separation of church and state? Came in a January the 1st, 1802 letter from Thomas Jefferson. I've got a quote from him. I didn't give it. He says, written in the cover of his Bible, he says, "I am a Christian and I am a follower and a disciple of Jesus Christ." In 1802, the Danbury Baptists had heard a rumor that the Congregationalist Church was going to be named the National Church. And they fired off a letter to Thomas Jefferson. And he wrote them back. And he said there is a wall of separation between the church and the state. Now, remember these court cases? There was a church meeting in the Capitol building in Washington at that time. It was not to protect the state from the church. It was to protect the church from the state. And he said there's a wall of separation. There's a clear wall of separation. You cannot breach this wall. The First Amendment was to protect the church from the state. Well, very quickly, let me give you two or three things. Anybody ever heard of Dr. William James? You heard of him? He came along and he was a psychologist and he was promoting anti-God things. And here's what he said. He said, "There is nothing so absurd, but if you say it loud enough and long enough, people will begin to believe it is fact." That's what he said. Say it loud enough, long enough, people will begin to believe it is fact. Well, in 1948, the first mention in a Supreme Court case, separation of church and state. 1958, one of the justices said, if you people keep mentioning separation of church and state, people are going to begin to believe it's in the Constitution. It's not. It's never been there. It never has been there. 1962 is when the tide turned. The tide turned, 1962. Engel versus Vitale. They removed school prayer from our schools. No more prayer. They said that it was a violation of separation of church and state. That's not in the Constitution. Not in there. They've warned. They said if you keep talking about it, people are going to believe it. You know how many precedents they gave? 0. 0. No precedents. They just came up with the idea, and the World Book Encyclopedia says it was a brand new doctrine and a new way in American politics. It was, because of the Christians in America did not protest, did not raise their voice. There was a whole new way in American politics. 1963, the Abington case. It dealt with Bible reading in public schools. And I'd like to talk to you about that, but let me just tell you, they ruled that it was unconstitutional, and here's their reason. They said reading the New Testament without explanation could cause psychological damage to students. The whole education was based on the Bible, on the primers, on Bible verses, everything. But now they say that could cause psychological damage to our students. What did George Washington say? Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that, what? Both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in the exclusion of religious principle. George Washington was a pretty smart guy. 45 years he served in public service. He was a surveyor, a number of things, a general, a farmer. He said, it cannot stand. It cannot stand an exclusion of religious principle. 1980, we got prayer, got Bible reading. 1980, the case of Stone versus Graham. Here's what they said. The 10 Commandments must come off the wall in a Kentucky schoolhouse. They said, why? We've just got it posted on the wall. It's been the foundation of America. Now listen at what the Supreme Court said. It will have the effect to induce the school children to read, to meditate upon, and perhaps to obey. And this is not a permissive objective. Our students might obey the 10 Commandments. You got to get them out of here. Don't corrupt their minds with the 10 Commandments. Now I want to give you one last quote. James Madison said this, one of our great presidents. He said, we have staked the future of all of our political institutions upon the capacity of each and every one of us to govern ourselves according to the 10 Commandments. The whole government is staked upon the 10 Commandments and our ability that we as a people can obey. But the Supreme Court says, it might cause us to, very quickly, what effect has that had? Wish I had more time, but I don't. But you know what effect that's had on us? 1963, teenage pregnancies, I can show you the chart. They were dropping, staying about the same. Beginning that year, we had a 500% increase in teenage pregnancies. Now remember, nations don't have souls. How does God judge nations? national calamities, and he allows them to reap what they sow. 500%. I could show you the charts. I'm not going to. Sexually transmitted diseases were up drastically. Divorce had actually been dropping. But for 15 years, consecutively, the rate of divorce went up. It tripled the very first year. SAT scores had never had more than everybody knows what an SAT score is, right? Test you take, you're getting out of high school, you want to take it. They've never changed by more than 2%. They started in 1926 is when it was instituted. It had never changed more than 2%, ever. Well, beginning in 1963, for 18 consecutive years, it dropped like a rock. Ooh, straight. You can look at the scale. It's going along, 1963. Ooh, dropped like a rock. And it stayed that way till the mid-1970s. And all of a sudden it leveled off and started coming back. And people said, well, see, that proves it wasn't anything but just some blip. No, what it proved, there were 1,000 private Christian schools. By 1970s, the mid-70s, there were 32,000 Christian schools that were teaching, and it leveled off at the bottom and started climbing again. And when they checked those SAT scores, they found out that the ones in the private school were about 100 points ahead of the public school. They were right back. Where were they? The private school was right back to where it had been in 1962. Is God trying to tell us something? Well, they told some senator. They said, look at these charts. Look at these graphs. He said, oh, that ain't nothing. Said, those private schools have so much money, and they got so much affluence, and they've got so much of this. Well, of course they get better scores. Well, they went back. And they went back and they checked the records. Did you know that the public schools were spending over $2,000 per student more than the private schools were spending at that time? The public schools are pouring money and money and money at the problem, and it's going nowhere. It's going nowhere. Violent crime. America, beginning in 1963, we lead the entire Western world in violent crime, divorce, teenage pregnancies, abortion, and illegal drugs. You know, what does that bring us down to? Jeremiah 6:16 says, go back to the old paths. Go back to the old ways. Go back. America, it's time to take a stand. We have what are we facing today? What are we facing with the Muslims? What are we facing with the terrorists and all of the things that are riveting our world? I mean, take so much the Boston Marathon, Fort Hood, San Bernardino, Orlando, Paris, Brussels, Istanbul, Bangladesh. What is going on? What is going on with all of the terrorist attacks and all of the things America and our administration won't even say radical Islam. They won't even speak it. They won't even say it. Radical Islam, the radical jihadist movement is alive and it's well and it's destroying. And their movement is to come into America little by little by little and to take over from within. They're coming to where you live. They're coming to your workplace. They're coming to your job. They're coming for you. And it's time for us to wake up. What about the boy that was expelled for writing a homework assignment? And he wrote it, "Why I Love Jesus." What about the coach who was fired for voluntarily praying before football games? What about the fire chief in Atlanta who was fired for writing a book on his own time about his Christian faith? What about the Marine, I believe it was a Marine, who was censured and court-martialed because her computer, you know how you have your computers and you have a Bible verse on it? She had a Bible verse on her computer. And I believe it was, well, I can't remember the verse, but it was a Bible verse that ran across her computer. I mean, where are we? Where are we? What from our nation, George Washington, from the men who said we have established a Christian nation and all people are free to worship, but this government is a Christian government, and it's our duty and our responsibility to elect Christians to office. Where have we come from there to here? Is there protest? Are we boycotting the stores? Are we marching in the streets? Are we protesting these decisions? Or are we going along? It's time for Americans, it's time for Christians to take a stand and say, I will stand for truth. I will stand against political correctness. I will stand for truth. I will stand against deception. I will stand. Don't let the newspaper define who you should be. Don't let the commentators tell you who should be. You take a stand for God and you believe God. It may cost you something. The human video they showed up here, it may cost you something. It may. But let us be people. The founding fathers in Boston, you know, some of them lost everything they had, but they gladly gave it for freedom and for God because they love God. What are we willing to sacrifice? What are we willing to give for our country? It's time.